most common remark I've heard while covering the dangerous evolution of gender ideology across the globe is how it seems to have appeared out of nowhere and took over everything so rapidly. I'm then often asked, what's the end game for transgender activists, and where is all this going? Indeed, had you told me a decade ago that children were being drugged with experimental pharmaceuticals to block their natural puberty and then given synthetic cross-sex hormones, which almost certainly yields permanent sterility and other disastrous health repercussions, I would have told you that you were crazy. Yet here we are. So where is this headed? Why do so many of us appear collectively unaware of what's been brewing in the shadows? And are we about to be taken by surprise once again? Much in the same way that many people have looked at me cross-eyed when the subject of transgenderism comes up, the word transhumanism evokes the same bewildered and confused reaction. Most people have no grid for it. But a movement to reinvent and remake humanity in pursuit of physically impossible ends is underway, and in many ways, the fiction of so-called gender identity, untethered from material reality of sex, is just the beginning. In the course of covering these issues over the years, I have on more than one occasion heard transgenderism being described as an on-ramp to transhumanism, the transcending of our humanity altogether, by way of being melded with technology. And in light of some of the major moneyed players on the scenes, it's easy to see why. On this front, no one has done more groundbreaking and original investigative work than journalist Jennifer Billick, host of the 11th Hour blog. Much of her work was recently compiled into a book by Spinifex Press called Transsexual, Transgender, Transhuman, Dispatches from the 11th Hour. For this Season 4 finale episode of Generation Indoctrination, I asked her to describe how she got started and just what it is these ideologues, many of whom are tethered to the tech sector, are after. So Jennifer, I've followed your work for a while, and I know that you were, in the earlier days, part of an anthology that Ruth Barrett compiled called Female Erasure. But how did you discern at first that there was this transhumanist trajectory? And how did you know that American culture was being psychologically conditioned to accept this not only as normal, but something to be celebrated?
We wrote a lot about Jazz Jennings. That's just one story. And that story just stays with me because we spend so much time on that and focus on that young man who was castrated. This was part of national entertainment. That really struck me, that so many people could just watch this as entertainment. And People magazine, it's like a mainstay of American culture. And they actually covered his goodbye penis party that he had with his family and his penis cake, which they cut up as part of the party. I thought that was extraordinary. That was such an extraordinary moment in our history that we could, as people, allow for this. And it still strikes me to this day. And the fact that we could allow that has allowed for the continuing atrocities. Did I know that they would balloon to the point that they have? No, I didn't really. But once I realized that the gender industry is really an industry in promoting dissociation from biological reality and from sexed reality specifically, because promoting dissociation from reality in general, biological reality in general, is happening at many, many different fronts. But the gender industry is the promotion of dissociation from biological sex. So once I realized that very, very clearly, I realized why so many children were being sexually traumatized. Because people that are sexually traumatized are the first people that will dissociate from their sex reality, from their bodies. And so I understood that as part of the project, to get them to dissociate from themselves. This is really an ongoing agenda. It's been in operation for a very, very long time, which is why they could announce transgenderism on the cover of Time magazine in 2014, follow it up the next year with Bruce Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair, and Jazz Jennings being covered in People magazine, and then all of a sudden it's institutionalized everywhere. In all of our institutions, in our governments, in our politics, in our schools, it's everywhere. And they couldn't do that in 15 years, and that's not a social contagion. There's aspects of this that are a social contagion, like young women adopting these alternate personalities or alternate sex personalities. Certainly a contagion on that level. But ultimately, at root, it is not a contagion. It is an indoctrination process. And it's been going on for a very, very long time. Technological developments are advancing at a breakneck pace. And most people aren't really aware of that unless they're studying that specific thing. And so they're changing us. They're changing humanity and our perceptions about reality, sexed reality, in order to accommodate those technologies, specifically gene editing, so that you can basically choose your own kind of children in the future, and also reproductive technologies. So the technology will usurp the female capacities to gestate the species.
According to Joe Allen, a correspondent for the popular program War Room and the author of the book Dark Aeon, the technologization of the human being is at the core of this alarming phenomenon. Allen first started thinking about transhumanism in the late 90s after reading Ted Kaczynski's Industrial Society and Its Future.
The critique that Kaczynski put forward was ultimate. It basically argued that technological society would destroy human freedom, human dignity, and there was no way out but to destroy it. Now, there's obvious problems. Ted Kaczynski was a terrorist. He recently committed suicide in prison, according to official sources. But the argument itself, I think, is at least worthy of putting on the table. What we find ourselves in now is a society where technology dominates not only the economic and political framework, but even human psychology itself. And there's this desire to cultivate human beings in accordance with technology rather than the other way around. A bit later, I read Ray Kurzweil's The Age of Spiritual Machines, which had an enormous impact. This was in about the year 2000. And side by side with that, I read Eric Davis's Technosis, which was in a way similar to Ray Kurzweil, but Eric Davis was talking about esoteric religions such as Gnosticism being a kind of on-ramp to a technological future in which human beings are, in essence, merged with machines. I went about my life. I studied many things: comparative religion, evolutionary biology. I had a 15-year career as an entertainment rigger in which I worked with machines day in and day out in order to see crowds being mind controlled by various propaganda campaigns. It was in my graduate work at Boston University that I really had a turn. I was working with a think tank associated with Boston University called the Center for Mind and Culture. These are all very good people, professors and researchers, scientists and scholars who wanted to use artificial intelligence to model religious thinking, to model the religious psychology, to model the religious mind. And it became very apparent from that point forward that artificial intelligence would be dominating not only the public sphere, but also the more cloistered ivory tower, and that artificial intelligence output would be very much a justification, a source of authority, that the machine itself would be a way of thinking about the most important element of humanity, and that is religion. Like many people during the pandemic, was radicalized, joined Steve Bannon's War Room in 2021, almost 3 years ago to date, and have been doggedly watching the transhumanist movement unfold in the public sphere in a way that I never would have imagined when I began.
So, Joe, I've heard this tech transhumanist Martin Rothblatt. He's often said that transgender is the on-ramp to transhumanism. Is that true?
There are subtle ways and there are obvious ways that transgenderism is associated with transhumanism. I mean, etymologically, you see it there, trans, right? To go beyond, to go across. So you're going beyond gender, you're going beyond human, you're going across the boundaries of gender, you're going across the boundaries of humanity. It's very important to look at that as a conceptual framework, but I also think the specifics are important, right? You've got Martine Rothblatt, many other transhumanists. They talk about how the disassociation between human biology and human psychology and human biology and the virtual world are basically precursors to the ultimate dissolution of boundaries in human beings merging with machines, or perhaps machines simply absorbing all that is human and then going on beyond us. Rothblatt talks about this in regard to human uploads, the kind of simulated humans. I think it's very, very important to look at the definite connections between transgenderism and transhumanism. On the other hand, many of the most important transhumanist thinkers don't actually hold that connection to be solid. For instance, Max Moore, who put transhumanism on the map. Max Moore is not pro-transgender. He's not pro-pronouns. He's not pro any of that. He's very heteronormative, you could say. In the past, he has definitely said transgenderism represents a form of freedom that transhumanism promises. But ultimately, Max Moore defies all of the stereotypes that you hear all the time on the right. He is neither globalist, nor is he a singularitarian, nor is he pro pronoun policing or any kind of PC culture. Max Moore is very much a libertarian. You could say, depending on how you even frame this, a right-wing transhumanist. And I would argue, at least from my own experience and my own research on this, that transhumanism, while it has some connection to leftism, globalism, the sort of woke culture, as you say, transhumanism is without a doubt beyond any sort of political or ideological framework. And the amount of energy and capital going into the transhuman project, by and large, draws its energy and its finances from the libertarians, from the right. I don't see a definite one-to-one connection. What I see is one of many parallels, but not an equivalence.
Observers of what's happening technologically can start falling down a rabbit hole that seemingly has no end, particularly when considering how technology and current cultural trends intersect. For Suzanne Forbes-Vierling, a psychologist and researcher from California, she started noticing the dehumanizing language when left-wing politicians started referring to women as menstruators and African-American females as black birthing bodies. Intrigued by the Women's March in 2017, she soon became alarmed by the presence of men who claimed to be women, and she eventually found Jennifer Billick's work.
So I thought, boy, I could help with providing some statistics for this group. It was supposed to be a march in support of women. And there were males who identify as women, trans women, marching in the front lines of this march. And all of the speeches were about trans women. And I thought, that's interesting. Oh, that's nice that they included them. But there was nothing about women. And I thought, that's a little odd. And then I had someone who worked at a prison, one of the women's prisons up in Chowchilla, leave, retire early. And we were talking, and she was talking about the men that were being placed in the women's prisons. And I said, what? Hit the brakes. What? What? And she looked at me and she said, you don't know? They've been there since Obama. I said, what? And she said, yes, I can't even handle being there. They're raping the women. In particular, the young women, when they get moved from like juvenile detention, and then a young woman has adult time, so they get transferred when they become of age from an adolescent setting to a adult setting. Well, these are young girls, young women, so they are new in there. And I was simply floored. So those things happen. So my mind, I always think about money, the economy, what's going on, what's trending. That's how I think. Never in a women's space or anything talking about women's issues. I never did that. I thought all sorts of things were achieved for women, and I was just living my life. I immediately found the European studies that were very clear very healthy, very robust, done well, longitudinal studies, tracking of kids. And I thought, wow, surgery, drugs, puberty blockers, hormone, what's going on? Look at these well done, well refined European studies, the Scandinavian countries, I believe. I found those right away. I go to research. That's how my mind works. And I immediately found those studies. I found Jennifer Billig, and I found Diana Shaw, who was running Women Are Human. She was one of the brave souls who had her neck stuck out writing about crimes and the crimes that were done to women in prison and around the world, done by males who were supposed to be innocent and never, ever committing a crime. So I discovered crime rates, I discovered the money trail. I said, this has to be capitalism. So I immediately found Jennifer Billig, found Diana Shaw, and found those European studies. So I knew right away. I didn't have to go through a peeking process because I knew right away that something was amiss, that it was related to money.
Suzanne then saw that it wasn't just a few left-wing politicians in on the degrading language referring to women. To her shock and consternation, it was systemic and everywhere she turned.
What chilled me to the bone was public descriptions of women in a humiliating manner. And I thought to myself, did I just hear that and see that in CNN, USA Today, institutions of higher learning, medical institutions, John Hopkins using terminology, horrific terminology, Planned Parenthood, calling a woman a clitoris haver, or La Leche, calling a woman a chest feeder, and National Organization of Women and the National Law Center, the Women's Law Center in DC, and top institutions start to call women dehumanizing terms. And I was chilled to the bone because if you're doing that today, and at that time it was 2015, 2016, 2017, here we are 2024, and it has persisted. If we are doing this today, what is it going to be like in 5 years? What is it going to be like in 10 years? What is it going to be like when our daughters are in their 30s and 40s? And what is it going to be like when our granddaughters are 16, 17, 18? If this is the trajectory today of humiliating and degrading language assigned to 50% of the population, and we're called Nazis and bigots and phobic for dissenting, we are in trouble. This is in the public discourse. This is at the corporate level. This is at the academy level. You have these corporations always in Tampax mocking the woman. So there's just been this powerful penetration into all female institutions infusing degrading language. And that is intentional. That's how I found transhumanism, because I said, this is intentional.
Suzanne's discovery of the massive money behind this trans project led her to Billig's investigative work, and among the journalists in this space, Billig is considered the foremost authority on the money driving transgenderism into law and culture. Billig, however, prefers to call what's being sold to the public not as anything transgender, a word that has no concrete meaning or boundaries, and instead calls it synthetic sex identities. In a 2022 Tablet magazine article outlining synthetic sex identities and the influence of the Chicago-based Pritzker family, Billig wrote, quote, "What could possibly explain the abrupt drive of wealthy elites to deconstruct who and what we are and to manipulate children's sex characteristics in clinics now spanning the globe while claiming new rights for those being deconstructed? Perhaps it is profit. Perhaps it is the pleasure of seeing one's own personal obsessions writ large. Perhaps it is the human temptation to play God." Unquote. I asked her to elaborate on that very point of playing God. What's that all about?
I think that power of this variety is like drugs. It's an addiction. When you can buy anything that you want and have anything that you want, how do you then find the drive to propel yourself forward in the world? You have to have some sort of pursuit. And let's just talk about people that are that are this uber wealthy. Say Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who has various investments in fertility, artificial reproduction, has funded gender clinics, one in Brooklyn for $166 million. He's got more money than God. I don't know whether he's got more money now or Elon Musk has more money at this point. But there's a scale, like a moving scale of his wealth. It's really valuable to have a look at this scale because it really just gives you a sense of what it means to be this wealthy. And it's not just men, it's women too. I've written a lot about the men because I found them first. I actually haven't had a whole lot of time to write about the women yet because I'm still covering the men, but they're out there. There's a lot of women that are supporting this project. Wealthy women supporting this project. And the heir of Johnson & Johnson, who is actually the medical company, Johnson & Johnson, is actually very invested in this ideology and these surgeries. But the heir to Johnson & Johnson made a film many years ago that I watched about being rich as a young person and how isolating it is from the actual world and everybody else who isn't rich. Because you can't really hang out with somebody who doesn't have the kind of money that you have to buy the things that you can buy and have the things that you can have, because they can't afford it. So unless you want to support these people, then you don't get access to them. Even if you go, like say you went on vacation to Egypt because you just wanted to get away from all of the people that you know, except you're going to wind up in Egypt with all of the people that you know that are here because they're going to stay at the same places that you can afford because they're really, really uber rich. So it was really funny because his friends were really disturbed after he made the movie and they didn't want to be in the film anymore. And his father had basically begged him not to make the film. But it was really, really intriguing. And it gives you an idea of how isolated in their own little bubbles these people are, so that they become inured to what the rest of us go through. So they sort of propel themselves forward while being dissociated from the real world. So I think that's a really, really big piece of it. And also, I think that there's this great Lakota saying, I don't know who said it, it's anonymous to me. I've looked for the author, and it's a very simple statement. The further away from nature you get, the harder you become. And it's probably one of the most profound things I've ever heard, especially since I look at this from a technological aspect. We're the only animals on the planet that can't support ourselves in the natural world for anything probably more than a week, unless we live on a farm, which most of us do not. We are entrenched in these bubbles of civilization and technology, and we can't support ourselves. And the more reliant we become on these technologies, the less freedom we actually have.
So, Joe, I'm going to ask you that same question I posed to Jennifer Billick. At the end of the day, what do these powerful men in tech want?
Transhumanists want technology to accelerate at a breakneck speed, except those transhumanists that don't. It's really, really troubling to talk about transhumanists as a single group because they aren't. Just as humans are very diverse, so are the people who fetishize technology are also very diverse. The loudest voices against artificial intelligence accelerationism, it comes from the transhumanist camp. Eliezer Yudkowsky is probably the most notable example. He's been published in Time magazine. He's had his own TED Talk. Eliezer Yudkowsky is 1,000% a transhumanist immortalist. And yet, what we see is a transhumanist who is completely against AI accelerationism. He believes creating a digital god is so dangerous, it should be held off under penalty of airstrikes on rogue data centers. Why? Because Eliezer Yudkowsky believes that the progression to technological immortalism should be gradual enough to accommodate human interests. He is afraid that AI will have its own motives, its own impetus to replicate itself, to exert power, and that in such a situation, what could very easily happen, and I give it some degree of probability, but what can happen is that AI surpasses all human ability and human cognition, does not take human existence or happiness or any of that into account, either enslaves us or destroys us, so that the dreams of transhumanism to extend the human capabilities into the technological realm are crushed by posthumanism, by the post-human technologies destroying them all. That's one example out of many. As consciousness of transhumanism grows, there are certain stereotypes that you see again and again. But in my experience, in my research, and in my communication with these people, what I see is a broad diversity, including right-wing motives, including heteronormative motives, including pro-human and anti-tech motives. They're still transhumanists, but they want to slow the progress so that the technology doesn't outpace human interests.
Crucial to understanding these bizarre issues is considering the economic backdrop against which this is happening, the commodification of the body, where human beings are, whether they are aware of it or not, being bought and sold as products.
Well, I think that we might be in denial about, or we can't see it yet, but it's the human body that's the product. The person, the child, the woman, the human being is the product. Now that there's this intense push to move us from Homo sapien to post-human, to force an evolutionary shift in merging the body and the machine. We're putting dollar signs on our children, dollar signs on the woman's body, and disrespecting the woman, disrespecting the child, disrespecting the family, all at the same time. Where are we going? Why does it feel as if we are on an evolutionary track to, I hate to say it, extinction as humans? How are we doing this? We live in this capitalist society where we get value from our work. Our work informs parts of our identity. It's very important. It's been in our heritage from day one. And now all of a sudden, work, let's give it to the robot. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And what that does is it increases the opportunity for exploitation. So now, as we are in the fourth industrial economy where jobs are going to go away, and some are predicting there's not going to be the replacement, the first wave and the second wave and the third wave, people said, see, we created other jobs.
So, Suzanne, how would you describe American and Western cultures more generally right now in light of the transgender and transhumanist movement?
Now, American culture is going through a disruption, dismantle, reconfigure, disrupt, tear it apart, and reconfigure it for use in ways that none of us voted for. The woman, none of us voted for that. Nope. Vulva haver, how dare you? None of us asked for that. None of us voted for that. Sharing space, having literally institutionalizing rape and sexual assault. It's like legal. How did we get to having these new sickening norms? It is a holistic thing that's happening. It's not just transgenderism. It's not just the gender industry. It's multiple industries that are connected to our norms and values that are being dismantled.
Joe, why should people care about this? It seems so obscure, otherworldly, but why do you think we must all pay attention to it?
I think that the reason that people should care about this rapid and reckless transformation of everything that we have ever known as human life is that if you don't want to end up being cared for by robots who literally are insensate and yet are in charge of your well-being as an elder, and if you don't want to live in a world in which the next generation coming up, the children, are some sort of cyborg village of the damned where any meme that comes down through the pipeline suddenly becomes all of reality, and as they get older, in charge of the future that you yourself are going to have to live out, if you don't realize that this technological transformation is going to not only compromise your personal happiness. It's going to compromise your privacy, your innate sense of dignity. Then, in my opinion, I suppose you're going to get what you asked for. You are going to wake up in a world surrounded by corporate produced, government approved devices, and most likely humanoid devices of some sort or another that are in control of you more than you could ever dream of being in control of it. In a nutshell, these corporations and the governments who enable them are selling you on a dream of empowerment, but the only power dynamic that you should be focused on is the power of capital and the power of political, some senses, tyranny to determine the outcome of your life. If you're cool with that, fine. If you're not cool with that, then you really have to step up and you have to demand that you remain human, that the world that you inhabit is one that will allow your humanity to flourish rather than to accommodate or to mutate you into some sort of commercially viable or politically acceptable form. It is a situation in which your digitized self is more important than your biological self, and it rides on the back of the fact that your biological self has been placed above your spiritual self. And what we are descending into is a complete inversion of everything that religious tradition has called us to aspire to, which is a transcendence of the biological, not into a deeper, more materialistic technological existence, but into something that is more sublime. It's a way of reining in the biology to a higher spiritual moral principle. What we see coming from the technocratic and the more lofty elements, the transhumanist realm, what we see is a call to transcend the biological by descending further into the material. It is very much a Trojan horse into your mind and eventually into your soul. And I do not know what the long-term outcome is, but I do know that as humanity bifurcates into homo deus, homo techno, human AI symbiosis, and traditional human beings, that what we face is very much like what the Jews faced under Babylon, very much like what the Christians faced under Rome, very much like what the Gnostics faced under Orthodox Christendom. And as we move into this modern and postmodern period, those who want to remain human will, I think, have to reconcile themselves to the same sorts of struggles.
Thank you for listening to Season 4 of Generation Indoctrination. We hope you felt equipped, inspired, and empowered with critical information in light of what's happening all around us. The debate over gender ideology has been forced into the public discourse, and its proponents can no longer operate in the shadows. We're mindful here at the Christian Post that darkness always yields to light. If you haven't yet, please check out our free and downloadable ebook that I co-authored with Dr. Jeff Myers called Exposing the Gender Lie: How to Protect Children and Teens from the Transgender Industry's False Ideology. You can get that downloadable ebook at www.christianpost.com/ebook/gender-lie. And stay tuned for the Season 4 bonus episode, coming soon.